dive into some of the motivations. Thank you very much. That's much appreciated. Okay, this is a Sharpie. I think this will exhibit adverse interactions with the board. So maybe you could check if the smartboard markers out there. Cheryl imported a bunch once, but I think they've seen the end of their life. Okay, so within this talk, I'm going to be following the agenda shown here. I'm going to be setting a bit of context and motivations for many of the motivations for use of smartphone methods that are prominent within our space, but which I think apply for a fair bit of the health space. Oh, much appreciated. That's great. That's great. Great. Okay. And maybe one of the TAs could use this to write on the board the URLs, right? Write them on both sides if you could. Thanks a bunch, Raheem. Much appreciated. So we're going to be setting the context, and then we're going to be talking about hallmarks of big data and health. There's a lot of use of this term big data now. It's in my view, it has a lot of regrettable hype associated with it. But there are some features of electronically sourced data in the health space that are notable and distinctive, and that bear on the value delivered for the type of smartphone-based data collection we'll be talking about. We'll then be talking about giving a glimpse of one smartphone-based data collection tool, not the only one, but one that we feel is particularly powerful, that we've designed from the ground up to be responsive to needs in health. That's the IEPI system, and Mohammed will be giving an overview of the latest incarnation of that later this morning. And we're going to be talking about how that system delivers value to different sub-areas of health in a brief way. We actually have a more, thank you very much, Raheem, a more sophisticated sort of enumeration of this that we'll be posting to the site as well. But I have a number of slides where I walk through what I consider sort of four major areas where there's particular delivered value, and talk about its use for different areas of health. And finally, I'll be making some concluding remarks before Kevin comes up. So much of the motivation for this sort of data collection for us lies in the fact that we, as a society and in fact worldwide, are confronting ever more complex health challenges that really are raising the bar for addressing health needs well above what we would have seen in decades past. These include a growing awareness of the fact that our increasingly interconnected world has vulnerabilities associated with those connections. When you cross the animal-human interface with emerging infectious diseases in areas of the world that were previously underinhabited, there's a whole set of challenges at a systemic level that link up the aspects of veterinary science and human health. In many areas, we're seeing the emergence of syndemics, situations where it's no longer provides enough insight to study a given disease or condition in isolation, but where we need to take out the interactions of conditions. An example would be interactions between chronic and communicable illness. For example, recent H1N1 pandemic suggesting links between obesity and H1N1, links between diabetes and tuberculosis, but also links that have a root in social issues, so substance abuse, crime, poverty, suicide, and violence. There's a growing awareness that a lot of the health issues we see are entangled, and it's not merely an accident that many of the communities that suffer the highest burdens of chronic disease also commonly suffer the highest burdens of communicable disease. We're also, of course, dealing at a fundamental level with the shifting demographics that leaves us with an aging population with very serious needs with which our healthcare systems are really struggling right now. Jenny back here in the corner is one of the the leading researchers within this area that we're so lucky to work with. And whether it's comorbid conditions, issues having to do with extending the care interface into people's homes in more robust fashions, or issues having to do with presentation for care due to individuals falling through the cracks. There's a set of needs that are not being met adequately by our healthcare system, and increasingly large data gaps that we need to address. We also are increasingly aware of the intergenerational effects that are shaping people's life courses, the occurrence of critical periods, and the long shadow cast by early life insults. These are factors that increasingly motivate researchers to take a life course perspective, recognizing the path dependence associated with health issues. An early adverse exposure or early traumatic event can have effects decades later, the evidence suggests. And in order to better understand that, there's a real need to expand our data collection lens, particularly with longitudinal instruments. In many areas, we're also aware of the critical need to collect information on networks. In some cases, these are informal care networks for those who are elderly or are suffering from multiple comorbid conditions. While traditional lens might focus on the patient who suffers those conditions, increasingly we realize that the leverage points and the opportunities for improving system performance lie within not just that person, but within their informal and former caregiver networks, the triangle that Jeff McDonald here speaks about so compellingly. In many cases, we also have recognized that relationships and network context is fundamental for shaping not just the spread of communicable illness, but the spread of norms, knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs that really predispose someone to vulnerability with respect to certain types of health outcomes, or with respect to protective factors. And many interventions also seeking to nudge behavior have sought to better understand that network context and the spatial context that forms such an important shaper within our experience. Our own sort of history coming to this is one of trying to build models to enhance decision making. And one of the things that we've grappled with is that many of the computational models that we involve to inform human health require is a strong word. They certainly benefit from a lot of data to tie them down. Require is not strictly true, but often we are operating in a context where, to develop confidence in our model, we seek to fill in gaps in the model that are not well addressed by the literature. These models help us understand the implications of empirical evidence for decision making, and we're going to be seeing on the third day how critically valuable the sort of data we're collecting within the course of this boot camp can be for informing those models. But increasingly, we're working with models that articulate theory, articulate dynamic hypotheses about underlying drivers for health conditions that are specified at a level of detail where the evidence that's available through traditional survey instruments and other tools doesn't measure up to our needs. And we're particularly interested in detailed longitudinal perspectives on a person's life that can give an understanding of the path dependence I mentioned earlier. To capture aspects of history, for example, of a person. History in terms of care-seeking behavior, perhaps, but also history in terms of exposures. We seek to understand aspects, the impact of the network position, their exposure to built environments, and other aspects that are spatial in character. And as we push towards models that articulate more more detail within their theories, there's a commensurate need to sort of collect additional types of information. And one of the key reflections here is that reliable data on key health behaviors are often hard to secure. Data on people's locations, their physical activity, their spatial proximity, social context, communication between them, and the rules or heuristics they use to make decisions are often elusive because of the level of temporal granularity or the level of burden that will be associated with collecting these sort of data using traditional instruments. So while our models in our work can really benefit from data concerning these factors, we're often coming up short in terms of availability on that data. Moreover, traditional data gained through, for example, random digit dialing is increasingly hard to collect for public health agencies. People are not responding, will often not have landlines to answer anymore, and it's increasingly hard to rely on traditional data sources, even where those once sufficed. So that was a bit of context setting. I'd like to now transition to discuss some of the hallmarks of big data within the health area. Much has been talked about prospects for big data within health, and broadly speaking, the term includes many things that are sort of cognate areas to the technologies we'll be talking about here. Much of it is focused on social media feeds, things like Twitter and Facebook updates that can provide insights to everything from transient communicable illness episodes to aspects of relationship status. We're going to be focusing within this event on consumer electronic devices and their capacity to collect sensor data, but also ecological momentary assessment data and crowdsourced data. But increasingly, those are also complemented by environmental sensors. Buildings these days are robots. Increasingly, buildings undertake active response to environmental conditions. They regulate the airflow, the humidity and pressure and temperature that surround us. And increasingly, there's environmental sensors at the level of broader city planning as well. We also see growing electronic availability of things such as test results, point of sale data on people's purchases, and health information related browsing behavior has been collected in many promising studies. Administrative data, of course, such as is gathered by HMOs or by provincial healthcare agencies, provides us with some insights into issues having to do with care-seeking behavior, diagnoses, and outcomes, but is often best to complement with questionnaire responses that give insight into the risk factors that are behind those data. And many agencies, including our Ministry of Health here in the province, are turning to questionnaires that are cross-linked with this administrative data. In other cases, people have tapped into voice recordings, tapped into audio to sense stress levels that are being felt by the respondent, or to monitor outgoing, incoming calls to get a sense of sort of social aspects of communication. And there's also a growing use of data from cell towers, from Wi-Fi networks, which can sense proximity of individuals. And very commonly, this sort of data can yield a great deal of a great volume of data, but increasingly strong insights as well. What are the characteristics of this data by which it stands out? Well, it's certainly distinguished by volume. There's lots of evidence that's being collected, but also by velocity. This is, I would argue, even more important. It's temporally fine-grained. We're collecting data perhaps every 30 seconds, perhaps every 10 minutes, perhaps every few minutes, but we have a much higher level of temporal resolution than has been typically supported by survey instruments or even by direct observation. There's, very importantly as well, a wide variety of data that's collected. This includes not only, say, accelerometry, but people's aspects of their position, their social positioning, how close they are to others, aspects having to do with their presence, things that give clues as to their presence indoors and outdoors, such as pressure, temperature, light levels, etc. And the variety of data supports triangulating, as it were, from multiple sensors for certain key behaviors. And finally, aspects of veracity. I don't want to overplay this. All the data that we collect ultimately has some biases associated with it, even though it's maybe objective data in the sense being resulting from physical measures. Which measures we collect and how frequently we collect them are ultimately decisions that are subject to some subjectivity and not purely objective. But the sort of data that we collect on things like physical activity, on using smartphone cameras, on aspects of eating habits by photographing the food ingested, are certainly less subject to some of the glaring self-report discrepancies that we see described in the literature and from StatsCan and other sources. We know since the NHANES 3 study in the States, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Study, in wave 3 of that, equipped folks with accelerometers to actually follow their physical activity levels, and we know that there was remarkable levels of disparity seen from what they self-reported. We know that similar things are true on the nutritional intake side, on reporting weight and other factors. And if you can measure these things physically in a minimally intrusive fashion, it can provide much greater confidence into the reliability of the results. Okay, the fortunate thing we're able to take advantage of here is that rich sensor platforms are increasingly embedded within consumer electronic devices used by individuals. And it's long been recognized the tremendous amounts of functionalities that come from smartphones that are supported by the apps that many of us carry with us and use to facilitate day-to-day work. What's less universally recognized is just how much these depend on the availability of sensors. And many of the apps that are out there secure their greatest value by tapping into sensors. You think about the pathfinding apps that recalculate based on your current position, or apps that do everything from recording your morning run to aspects of recording lectures. All of these are supported fundamentally by sensors. And these sensors can be repurposed at little cost to their original function to lend health insight. And really that's sort of one of the motivating reflections of this event and of the system that Mohammed will be introducing later this morning. In addition to that, we are increasingly surrounded by a wireless cacophony of signals that serve, once again, to deliver operational value. They help connect you to printers. They help you be connected to your wireless headsets. They help you communicate with aspects of your car's function, and they help you communicate with loved ones. But they also provide tremendous insight into our context, where we are, with whom we are over time. Aspects of inter-individual proximity, our location, indoors and outdoors, and can broadly sort of help disambiguate aspects of our context. So I've spoken about, at a high level, about big data and health. I'd like to talk a little bit about this IEPI system as one instance of a smartphone-based data collection system about which you'll be hearing more. And because Mohammed will be introducing elements of it in more detail in a few minutes, in a few hours, I'm going to be going a little bit lighter on this. This is fundamentally an app. This is an early version of it that's been deprecated in its depiction, but it's this is a system that runs on Google Android smartphones. It's an Android 4 app, and because it runs on smartphones, people do tend to have incentives to carry the device and keep it charged. After all, it links them up to their family, to their friends, to their work, etc. And there's episodic data collection that goes on that collects data and at the same time balances it with battery life. And it collects a diverse set of sensor modalities that Kevin will be talking about in quite some detail. So broadly speaking, there's a set of data collected on this phone, which includes data collected on the device itself, as well as some additional external devices. For example, weight scales. Michael over there has interfaced it with the Mia watch for measuring heart rate, as well as other features. And periodically and episodically, on an opportunistic basis, the data gathered by the phone is backhauled to our servers, or to Ethica servers. And this data can then be analyzed with a variety of tools. And we'll be introducing you to some of those tools tomorrow, which can lend insight into this data. The important thing is that this backhaul needs to be secure to protect confidentiality. It further needs to occur on a catch-as-catch-can basis based on the availability of appropriate types of network, which will vary study to study, whether it's Wi-Fi or whether it's a cell phone network, et cetera. So these are some of the types of sensors that are collected by this system, and Kevin will be talking about some of their salient features, some of where they can provide insight, and much of the event will be spent in sort of seeing how these can lend insight into your particular research questions. Not surprisingly, we designed this system, the first iteration of it, I think about 6 years ago, to address a wide variety of data gaps with respect to common needs. And you'll recognize this slide from earlier as highlighting areas where it's hard with traditional instruments to get the level of insights that we need for many of our research questions. So these are particular types of areas where we've put an emphasis on collecting data using these phones. Now, in addition to the sensors, which are not to be underestimated in terms of the insights that they can offer, there's a key need to complement the data from devices like this with additional modalities of data collection. And one of the most popular ones is questionnaires. To use the device as a versatile, flexible, and fairly unintrusive data collection mechanism to allow micro questionnaires that can be popped up based on particular contextual cues. And the system that Mohammed will be talking about, as well as one that you'll interact with some of the TAs, will support basically triggering these sort of questionnaires under certain contexts, rather. So it may be based on certain locations, maybe when an individual is in the proximity of a certain number of other detected individuals, or it could be as something as prosaic as when the user presses a button to report a given occurrence, say exposure to an anti-tobacco ad. Now, these questionnaires follow traditional experience sampling or ecological momentary assessment protocols, except that by tying them to particular exposures, we can often make them more temporally proximate to sort of episodes of interest. So we might be able to ask a person about their experience in a park while they're in that park, or their thoughts on a pro-tobacco promotion that they encounter in a store while it's in front of them. And that can help reduce recall bias, and it can help lend additional insight. It can also help us sort of disambiguate certain activity. One of the first uses of these sort of questionnaires, I remember going back many years, was to better understand the purposes for physical activity that were captured with the accelerometers. Was it for utilitarian reasons, recreational reasons? Was it for health-oriented reasons? What motivated this physical activity? What sort of stressors or emotions might be associated with smoking episodes, for example? In addition to these questionnaires, there's also a very powerful use of devices like this to support crowdsourcing. And we've certainly made very heavy use of this in recent projects. Here, the idea is that a given study will have a custom interface where certain buttons or other widgets will be revealed to a user, and the user can press those buttons to report incidents that may be of interest to the study designers. These could include, for example, aspects of subclinical symptomology, aspects, I have a stomach ache today, which might or might not be related to foodborne illness, but might be of interest for those studying possible foodborne illness occurrences. Or it might be exposures to adverse air quality, exposures to social stressors that might be of relevance for a mental health study. Or it could be occurrence of administration of medicines, of testing of blood glucose or food consumption. These might be things where just a button press is enough, or it might be things where you want them to take a photo, or you want them to fill out some answers to questions. But in any case, by study basis, often we secure value by complementing the sensor data and the questionnaire data with proactively reported user data that is specific to study needs. A foremost goal for this system and other systems like it needs to be security, and guaranteeing other aspects of confidentiality. The IEPI system that you'll be seeing has long put an emphasis on the capacity to snooze the system. In other words, to stop automated data collection to provide some modicum of privacy for a person for a delineated period of time. But there's also a need to put in place mechanisms in the form of encryption, secure transmission, and potentially actively censoring certain types of data to help enhance the degree of confidentiality that can be guaranteed to individuals. Ultimately, as Kevin will talk about, the sort of data we're collecting here does require a lot of thinking on the part of ethics boards. We've been very actively engaged with ours for probably the past 7 years about these sort of technologies, and we have a very fruitful relationship with them, and it's a relationship that we've seen built on with other ethics boards at other institutions. But it does require a very conscious thinking about the benefits and trade-offs and risks associated with the data, and putting in place a process that helps enhance the chance that research investigation won't inadvertently expose an individual. This is something I think, Kevin, you're going to be talking about some. Is that right?
I mentioned it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Key constraint on all of this that underlies a lot of this work is energy. It turns out that nothing comes for free, and to collect this sort of data does impose some load on the phone. Mohammed, with his system, and others, have put a strong emphasis on trying to get the greatest bang for the buck in terms of the energy available on a phone through the batteries. But there's no question that if you are not careful with battery life, you will shortchange the data collected, both due to the occasional occurrence where the battery is exhausted, but reduced compliance in the form of people uninstalling apps or otherwise keeping the phone off. Fortunately, we can take advantage of the exponential growth in power efficiencies seen over time. Some of you may have heard of Moore's law, the old adage that the number of transistors that can be fit on a given chip approximately doubles every 18 months. And Moore's law is starting to run into some real challenges associated with quantum mechanical effects. But Kumi's law, this similar relationship of log linear scaling, that every few years you double the power efficiency in terms of devices, has been proceeding at a rate now for decades and shows no signs of slowing down. We increasingly know how to build smartphones and other consumer electronic devices that are extremely power frugal, and much of the success of IEPI builds on that. In fact, the fact that the smartphones now are so much better than those 5 years ago in terms of data efficiency. So what's the sort of data that can be collected? Well, social network data, for example, for different periods of time, evolving social networks, contact duration between different individuals. We can also realize that what often yields the biggest insights is not just data from one modality alone, data from the questionnaires or data from one particular sensor, but the capacity to cross-link that data. Some of you may have heard of Metcalfe's law. Metcalfe's law posits that the value of a computer network, such as the network in this room, or indeed the wire internet, rises with the square of the number of nodes in the network. And the idea is that each successive person added to the network secures value by being able to communicate with any of the people already on the network. And there's a similar benefit that's secured by cross-linking data. It's really not just particular data items in isolation, but their ability to link them up and to ask questions that combine them that yields the biggest insight. So there may be, physical activity level over space, location of where contacts take place within the city, or at different times over the day, the spaces within a building where contacts of different sorts take place. And it's also the capacity to combine the data from the phones with additional data sources, such as environmental sensing systems, GIS databases, even things as prosaic as weather reports. For those who are new to Saskatoon, we are known to exhibit a measure of seasonal variability in weather, and there can be considerable insight gained by taking the weather information that obtains for your region of the city at a given time and linking it to aspects of people's mobility behavior or aspects of physical activity, sedentary behavior. And it's a very common pattern that you might see in South Texas as well, or I would even hazard in many of the regions of the states. So cross-linking these types of data, both within the device, the sensor data, the EMA data from the questionnaires, the crowdsourced data with additional data sources externally is often your ticket to greatest sight. So how do you make sense of this data? Well, we'll be having quite a bit of discussion of this. Broadly speaking, there's a hierarchy of models in a processing that's used to make sense of it. And we'll be briefly taking a look at several layers of this data stack that help us make sense of what's collected. The most basic set associated with them are some simple filtering methods and data quality mechanisms that will help throw out obvious outliers or inappropriate data. An example would be cases where the GPS system fails and reports that the individual as being at the 00 location of latitude longitude, which lies somewhere off the west coast of Africa, if memory serves me. And so often there's a pre-pass where certain data like that gets thrown out. But just at the level above that, there's a set of machine learning algorithms, some of which will be presented by Narges here in the back. I'll be presenting some of her work and work by William, who's maybe outside. There he is, also in the back. Machine learning algorithms to classify the data, to basically get an insight of, are you indoors or outdoors? Are you likely to be in a vehicle or not, something on which Raheem is working? But even something as basic as, do you have the phone with you right now? Are you carrying it? Or is it merely sitting in a backpack or sitting on a desk? These things are key for censoring the data so that we don't take into account any data points that are unreliable, but are also very valuable for certain types of health insight. For example, recognizing aspects of vehicular context in as much as it bears on sedentary behavior. At a level above this, there's a set of inferencing models that are often defined in a Bayesian context, and that might allow us to for example, sleuth down where pathogen reservoirs might be living on surfaces within a long-term care facility, or recognize individuals who might be carriers of MRSA without so that we could prioritize testing of surfaces or individuals. And finally, a set of dynamic models that I'll be discussing on the final day of the workshop for those who are interested that help link this data to decision making, that help link it to strategic choices. And we'll come back to these sorts of models, but suffice it to say there's a diversity of models, some of which are a little bit more straightforward, some of which are more sophisticated. I'd like to sort of talk in my last 15 minutes here a little bit about the value of this data for different areas. We'll be hearing more about this in the course of the week, but broadly speaking, I think about this data as providing insights at many levels of health and healthcare system, and in many specific ways. It fits in with the research context in many specific ways. And I, in my naive way, am going to attempt to sort of elucidate some of those here, bearing in mind that some real insights might come from this event itself. So one of the needs in which we've been quite interested in using these systems is actually a little bit more familiar from the Fitbits, Jawbones, and other systems of the world. And that is to provide individuals, particularly motivated individuals, who are seeking to care for themselves, whether it's in terms of pushing their fitness limits or in terms of their day-to-day experience of self-care, provide them with a more perfect mirror to understand their behavior day to day, to be able to link up their daily run or daily movement about a personal care home with some understanding about sedentary behavior, physical activity, and risk factors that they might be able to work on. Now, this has really been emphasized at the level of self-care by the industry, and unfortunately, many of the systems that are so popular out there are geared towards people who are already highly motivated in investing in their health. What I think is a bigger growth area there is those individuals who are at risk, may not be fitness oriented, but are vulnerable, and can use this thing to better inform their own activity, but even more so within their informal care networks. So providing those who care for individuals with developmental difficulties, autistic individuals, individuals with Down syndrome, providing their families a picture of their life that helps them fill in an understanding about if they might be at risk of depression, for example, or might be at risk of a manic episode. There's also needs on the informal care basis in a giant way for elder care. And Jenny here again is one of the pioneers in thinking about this area and brings huge amounts of insight that I could never think to match. At the next level up for that are issues having to do with clinical management, helping clinicians, allied health professionals understand patient challenges associated with self-care and informal care, subclinical symptomologies that they may be experiencing, or contexts in which they circulate. How often are they measuring their blood sugar levels? How reliably are they taking the right insulin doses? Or to what degree are they out and about in terms of physical activity? There's a broad need here, particularly as clinical oversight becomes really pressed in terms of dealing with the diseases of an aging population, to enhance insight. At a level up from that, I think of a set of needs associated with health service delivery, identifying bottlenecks, quantifying key delays, identifying time to decision data associated with a ED unit in a way that's going to be more reliable than what we get through electronic systems, where people are often, doctor might enter four patients in a row that they've kind of batched up. There's a set of operational decision-making needs having to do with, for example, prioritizing testing for nosocomial infection, faster outbreak identification and localization for foodborne illness, like Cheryl is working with us on, and evaluating control strategies that whether it's for a communicable illness such as influenza or for something within the context of a facility, can be very, very helpful. And then finally, strategic decision-making needs. Identifying the patterns of care and informal care and self-care and contacts with the care system, as well as alternative care modalities that might suggest high leverage opportunities for reforming the system or restructuring the system where care is delivered. This again is something where we're so privileged to work with Jenny and where she has tremendous insight, and where I think the data collected by these systems can fill a lot of gaps to help us understand what's possible, what might be high priority. So, in addition to that, which sort of addressed different levels in a way that is similar to the article Kevin and I contributed in an invited editorial for Annals of Family Medicine 4 or 5 years ago. I wanted to sort of highlight 4 areas where I think there's particularly benefit, and time is running short. I don't know if I'll have time to go into them in as much detail as I'd like, but these are things that are often on my mind a lot when I think about key value propositions advanced by these tools. One is the issue of assessing symptoms, both sort of clinically relevant symptoms and subclinical symptoms, as well as cognitions and behaviors in relation to risk factors and exposures. Understanding how an individual's occurrences of coughing and wheezing might be related, for example, to their exposure to adverse air quality or to particular types of air quality, exposures to grain bins or to feedlots. Understanding how my adverse mental health, say suicidal ideation symptoms, might be related to social stressors or to physical activity that I've undergone, to aspects of sedentary behavior. There's a whole set of insights having to do with causal pathways here that could be key in the sense of understanding how to best inform a particular individual to lower their vulnerabilities and how to best strengthen the support network or the physical environment for that person, say in terms of improved ventilation, which we can really pick up with a device like this in ways that would be much harder to pick up with a traditional, say, self-report incident, or very burdensome with direct observation. So that's sort of one area. A second area has to do with enhancing the speed, reliability, and depth of learning from implemented interventions. And in fact, I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go through each of these in turn very briefly. So the first of that symptoms, I listed out here for different areas, for obesity-related issues, tobacco-related disease, environmental epi, communicable illness, mental health, and health service delivery. Different components of that first type of thing, of how we link up symptoms, symptomology, aspects of cognitions and behaviors to exposures and to particular events, sort of micro events that occur in the span of a day. And I've sort of enumerated these for different components. I do this partly because I know the people coming here are from different backgrounds, and I thought this might be of interest in getting you to think about possible areas of application. In the second one, really this is about enhancing our ability to learn. And those who know who are aware of my work with modeling know that we put a large amount of emphasis on using models as learning tools, nay, as Jeff has spoken, as learning prostheses, tools that help us complement our limitations so we can learn more quickly, more reliably, and more robustly. And I think the types of systems we're going to be talking about in these 3 days address many of those needs as well. They're another piece of the puzzle. And particularly with respect to this issue of learning from interventions. The basic deal here is that it has to do with the variety and the velocity of the sort of data we're collecting with these devices. we can pick up over time outcome measures and on a variety of types of outcomes, mobility, behavior, aspects of physical activity, aspects of socialization, etc., that are associated with different pathways which an intervention may nudge. And regardless of whether the intervention is successful or not, we may be able to learn from it more effectively and formulate a more effective intervention at a much stronger way because we've picked up these sort of pathways. So an example of this is work that we partnered up with Jeannie Brooks Gunn at Columbia University in the city of New York, looking at the impacts of housing voucher interventions on health behavior. So the idea here is that that there's diverse hypotheses concerning the underpinnings for empirical observations associated with housing vouchers. So from the Moving to Opportunity study in the States, which some of you may be aware, there's observations of the impact of moving from a low-income neighborhood to a mixed-income neighborhood in terms of certain broad outcomes. Obesity levels. It tended to lower the obesity levels among but adolescent women within the study. It also lowered those same women's likelihood of participation in criminal activity and enhanced their high school graduation rates. Really encouraging findings with respect to outcomes for adolescent females. For adolescent males, however, the outcome was decidedly mixed. There was actually a much smaller and far less encouraging change in obesity levels, and it actually enhanced participation in criminal activity in teenage males. This actually went up as a result of the intervention. And I think high school graduation rates, I don't remember the strength of the outcomes there, but it was not a big increase. And there were a lot of questions about what was going on here. If we take adolescent female outcomes, some individuals surmised that in the new neighborhoods, there was higher amounts of recreational space. Surely true. Higher amounts of parks, higher availability of ball courts and of areas where individuals could play in playgrounds. And surely that may have led to some levels of physical activity change, and perhaps that rippled through to changes in BMI and hence obesity levels. Other researchers pointed instead to aspects of the perceived safety of the neighborhood. It was a safer neighborhood. You could get out and walk the sidewalks more. People could be out and about with less risk later in the day, and hence that changed physical activity and lowered sedentary behavior. So not only through moderate, vigorous physical activity, but through sedentary behavior. In other cases, researchers pointed to the fact that, these neighborhoods to which these individuals have been moved are better addressed by grocery stores with fresh fruits and vegetables. There's more availability of these types of healthy foods. The food environment, in short, is enhanced, and therefore maybe the gains in obesity were actually mostly mediated by healthiness of diet. And others argued, no, maybe a lot of the effects are the fact that these girls' social networks have been disrupted, so they're spending more time at home. They're eating mom's cooking rather than going out to McDonald's with friends, and therefore, they're less likely to be involved in criminal activity, and because they're staying at home more, and their obesity goes down because of it. In short, a lot of different theories that were advanced, and the outcome measures that were recorded were not accurate enough to really delineate between these. They depended on self-report of where I ate over the past month or past 3 months. They depended on self-report of physical activity that we know is very, very unreliable, and same thing with sedentary behavior, and same thing with time spent at home. These are not things that we can look to people to give accurate self-reports on over a multi-month type of time frame. And this is exactly the sort of thing where if you have a tool, such as I've talked about, you can actually pick up aspects of physical activity, sedentary behavior, where people are eating, with whom they're eating, aspects of healthiness of diet using a smartphone's camera that can help to tease out these pathways. Now, suppose that this study was highly mixed, even in teenage girls. Well, we could learn which of these pathways we have nudged successfully and which of them need more work. Maybe it's aspects of use of recreational space that are neglected. Maybe it's components of availability of healthy foods. We might be able to complement an intervention with income subsidies that would help purchase foods to help address that pathway that hasn't been really moved as much as we had hoped. The point is, if we have an intervention and broad outcomes, and we don't have a careful, sort of precise, high-resolution lens on what's going on in between, we're often left grappling with uncertainty about how we can do better. If we can delineate these pathways, know which we've improved, which we haven't, we can learn much more deeply, robustly, quickly from that intervention and formulate a better intervention that'll be even more responsive to the needs of our group. So this is a sort of exemplar that I think about when learning from interventions. I want to finish up here very quickly, so let me just note here that this general principle of learning more quickly from interventions extends across many, many areas. I've listed some here, including mental health, communicable illness, tobacco-related disease, obesity. An additional component of this has to do with aspects of choice. For example, how do people's choices with respect to use of nicotine products, say e-cigarettes versus traditional cigarettes or cigarillos, other types of modalities for smoking or vaping, how does that vary with distance from a source or price or it says food type, but product type? How does the choice to smoke, vape, or neither depend on availability? Within the environmental context, how does use of personal protective behavior, for example, masks, vary with temperature and risk perception? Or think about West Nile virus. To what degree are people out circulating with bug spray on and with long sleeves and pants when it's 32 out, or in the 80s, high 80s for those from the States? In the communicable illness side, to what degree are contact behaviors reflective of transportation options or reflective of my my work context? These are aspects having to do with choice and particularly like choice for transportation options, choice in terms of personal protective behaviors, in terms of products, and the same thing with obesity and physical activity, for example, or eating patterns. Finally, there are some types of challenges that relate to sort of delineating texture of day-to-day life for participants. And this is one of the big motivations for some people for using these technologies. We can get a picture of what's going on day-to-day in people's lives that's so much richer than what we could with traditional instruments. I remember I was leading a session about a month and a half ago for NHLBI in the States. This was a session focused on sort of implementation science needs for the National Lung and Blood and Sleep Institute. And one of the issues that came up was brought up by Robert Kaplan, who's head of AHRQ, the Association for Health Research Quality. And one of the things that he was talking about is that when it came to compliance of his patients when he was a practicing physician, one of the things he really struggled with is that patients would fall through the cracks for reasons that wouldn't be picked up with traditional instruments. He recounted the case of one woman who was having terrible times maintaining blood sugar level within adequate limits. And every time she would come there, they would educate her about the importance of this, and she would go off and vow to try to improve, and it would come back. Her HbA1c level was really high. She was really suffering from an inability to control her blood sugar in a way that would really put her at risk of complications. And they were trying to understand this, and it took years before they really understood that what was going on with this woman is that she led a life that was so tumultuous and discombobulated. She didn't know where day to day she was going to be able to work. She was working on an opportunistic basis. She didn't know if she'd need care for her kids. You know, everything was just on an ad hoc basis day to day. And naturally, the compliance needs fell through the cracks because she had to scramble every morning to figure out how her kids were going to be taken care of through the day, so that she could get to this opportunistic work possibility or make it into a shift at some work site. So here, the texture of this day-to-day life was missing to them. And he said, you know, if only we had been able to pick that up, we could have helped this person much sooner. And so it is with a lot of cases. We're capturing some aspects of context, to be sure, through traditional instruments. But a lot of the time, what could give us the greatest insight in terms of understanding variability and outcomes, understanding the variability, for example, between individuals who have gestational diabetes in terms of risk of a macrosomic infant, risk of obesity in the child, or subsequent type 2 diabetes in the mother. To really understand that variability in outcomes, we look to traditional covariates that are very crude and often very unreliable in what they pick up. And what we can pick up with these sensors and with these reports are the day-to-day texture of experience that can be so much richer than that and so much more explanatory and so much more helpful in understanding what needs to change. So just a few broad conclusions. I know I've gone a little bit over time here. Sensors are increasing ubiquitous. Commodity sensor-bearing devices can serve a dual use as versatile sensor, but also ecological momentary assessment. So with these questionnaires and crowdsourcing platforms. There's diverse communication support, the communication all around us that can support driving our context, where we are, with whom we are, in a way that is fundamental for understanding our exposures in our situated context. Coupled with models, and I talked about that hierarchy of models, sensor data can help us understand, help deliver significant and complementary health insights. There's a particular prospect, I think, for learning from, as Bobby Milstein said once, in public health, we're seeking to redirect the course of change. We're seeking to change our health futures. And one of the most critical needs there is learning how to improve things more reliably, learning more quickly from our attempts, our interventions, whether successful or not, so we can do better next time. And I think this is one of the key uses of these sorts of technologies. But in general, these sort of cross-linked sensor-based and EMA technologies can offer tremendous potential to complement and sharpen traditional methods. This is not about throwing out the baby with the bathwater. It's not about doing away with traditional surveys. It's about complementing them with tools and techniques that will help provide additional texture and richness, additional understanding to the health challenges that we face, so that we can help address those health challenges in a more responsive fashion. So those are all the comments I have for right now. And I think we're due for a break. And then, Kevin, you'll be on. Is that right? Any questions, though, comments people want to bring up? Bearing in mind that this is just sort of an introductory look, and Kevin will be going into quite a bit more detail in Mohammed than on IEPI. Any questions or comments? Okay. Shall we break for 10 minutes, and we'll get Kevin set up? Okay. Coffee is just to the right of the door? Thanks. Yes.